Well, welcome everybody. We're excited for this month's live freight market webinar, where we're going to go over the report with all of the data, everything that's going on in the freight market. There's obviously a lot to cover, a lot of ground to cover. So super excited to have Steve Beda with us as always, and our special guest, Martin O'Connor. So I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves before we kind of dive in. So Steve, give us a little info on yourself, your role at Trax, and we'll
Sure. Well, glad to be here and glad to have Martin joining us today. Excited about that. Steve Beda, Executive Vice President of Customer Engagement Advisory at Trax. I oversee a lot of our customer programs. I measure and evaluate how we're performing, how they're performing, assist in recommending sort of optimization strategies, both around our programs as well as their own execution strategies. And obviously a lot to talk about today, given the market conditions. So happy to be here, Joy.
Glad.
Martin?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think since the last time I was on this, I think my title's changed. So still with Trax, Director of Carrier Advisory and Engagement. So this is a slightly new role, but really my day-to-day task is to keep my finger on the pulse and understand how the carriers are thinking, behaving, feeling. But it's been really great. It's been really insightful. We've always, historically, we've always had engagement with the carriers anyway. It's a large part of what we offer as a company, but just being able to kind of engage on a strategic level, getting that feedback where we can improve, but equally giving carriers feedback on where we think they can improve. So really collaborative, and hopefully bring a slightly different perspective and a slightly different insight to this webinar.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, we're glad to have that perspective for sure, because, like we said at the top, there's lots going on as always. We always say, what are you, predictably unpredictable, murky waters. We never quite know what this webinar is going to entail. The marketing team always wants us to give a really good description, and we can't. So it's always, data dropped even this morning that we kind of are going to cover today. So, Steve, kind of kick us off with the things that, the Logistics Manager Index is obviously something that we always look at, and all the kind of trends and aggregates and things like that. Is that where you want to start contextually?
Sure.
Kind of get the lay of the land.
Yeah, sure. So, if we had an elephant in the room, it would be this capacity constraint that the carriers have. We could talk about how we got here and maybe how we get out of that. But certainly that's caused a price increase both in contract rate and spot rate. So shippers are feeling the pain. If we had a sort of the gas gauge measurement, it definitely leans toward carrier right now. It's hard to avoid that. So relationships, as Martin talked about, is really important right now to secure capacity, because when it's tight, you want to have good relationships with your carriers and LSPs, right? But if you want to pop the LMI aggregate, I find that to be a pretty interesting indicator. It's somewhat new from LMI, and it basically indexes the total cost, warehousing, transportation, and inventory. And obviously, if you were to break that out into percentages or a percentile, transportation leads the march in terms of why that graph is showing that increase. Now, the incremental increase has decreased, I guess, if you will, or the slope may start to level off a little bit. But, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know when that will all happen. But certainly it costs more to ship, and that's really top of mind for all shippers today. And I'd be curious to know and understand maybe from Martin a little bit on the carrier side, what they're seeing. They're doing actually fairly well, right? Their margins are up, and they're able to navigate this. Nobody wants to lose business, but they're being very skittish about investments, and we saw that coming in from 25, and now it's carried on to 26. Now, maybe that's a backlash from the great freight recession that took place in 24 and early 25. And so they're very hesitant to invest. But these things typically come in cycles. And we're at the cycle right now where obviously, carrier pricing is up, capacity is down. The real question is, when are they going to invest? What are the carriers thinking about that investment? And when will we level things off? And demand has a lot to do with that too. And we have some late numbers coming out today. GDP in the U.S. was 2.1 in Q1, which is better than zero, but certainly not as good as you maybe wanted like to see it. And inflation is still at about 3.4 less fuel, about 4.2 with fuel. So fuel is still a problem. And that's on top of the higher prices due to capacity. That has nothing to do with capacity. That just has to do with the issues in the Middle East. So, yeah, it's a tough time, in terms of managing budgets that are related to transportation costs. So it'd be interesting to hear, Martin, maybe what you're hearing from the carriers and how they're responding to all of this from your perspective.
Absolutely. I think for me, we talked a lot about this before we came on air. Things have changed. The market's almost flipped. Carriers had a difficult couple of years, right? For me, this is now where in some ways, conditions favor the carriers, right? And that's maybe something they've became a little bit unfamiliar with. So certainly everything we've talked about in terms of it's the supply rather than demand. The demand might catch up. But what I thought was interesting, obviously, Joy shared the LMI reading the highest ever being at 96. The other thing that was really interesting in the freight market report that I'm sure we'll send out to people if they want to read it was the tendered percentage versus the accepted percentage, 8 or 9% versus 1%. That for me really kind of vindicates, if you like, that this isn't about demand; it's a capacity shortage. So I think this is something where the carriers will need to invest. That doesn't happen overnight. That's something where they will need to invest in equipment and they need to invest in people. And hopefully, as you said, the kind of uncertainty or the nervousness, hopefully that subsides because I don't see this. This is here to stay for a while.
Yeah, yeah, and the trends have shown that consistently, month over month. I as much as I tried to relax when I was in Florida last week, I did run into somebody that owns a brokerage firm, and they do intermodal, and they're blowing it out. So I asked him why. They're doing well right now, and I was particularly curious on intermodal freight, what advantages they had because they're picking up new lanes all the time, and it seems to be that this inventory balance between transportation and inventory has affected the mode of transport as well. So in other words, you can use slower moving freight over rail combined with drays to get product from A to B than maybe LTL, for instance, or some other mode. So they're actually doing really well. That shows you that also shippers, Martin, are trying to mitigate costs by shifting modality, stocking more inventory possibly. And we saw that, I believe, in the report, the buy forwards of inventory, and using slower modes of transport to move that inventory to its final destination. So I don't know if you have any thinking on that, Martin, but yeah, 3PLs are doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's the thing. I think given the nature of it right now, I think rates are going up or are going to continue going up. Shippers will need to be smart. Shippers will need to look at what their kind of overview is in terms of what needs to get where and when. As you said, if something can be more cost effective, but necessarily not get there in the same amount of time, that's one path to take. I think it is really important to maintain that relationship. It's not always about cost, because carriers have a long memory. Carriers remember who paid on time. So certainly from that perspective, yes, it's more expensive, but you also need to keep a wide variety of things under consideration, and not just let cost dictate your decision making process.
I think that's a really good point, Martin. So Joy, this market really requires the ecosystem, which involves shipper, carrier, LSP. Securing this capacity is so important in that relationship. Forecasting properly, meeting with the carrier on a regular basis, understand what shipping patterns are forecasted to ensure that capacity is available. I would say that's a peak concern and importance right now, along with mitigation strategies that shippers have in terms of trying to lower the cost to serve where they can, right? So, Martin, I'm curious to know, we talk about carrier scorecarding a lot, but in terms of that relationship with the carrier, what do you see as like the top measuring stick KPI or factors that go into that relationship and how it's measured and managed?
Yeah, there's a lot. I think I mentioned about paying on time. Obviously, we play a role in that in the free movement of commerce. But no, I think it's maintaining the relationship. It's about having a collaborative discussion. If you start with what's the cheapest that this can happen, it's a short conversation, right? I think probably magic on-time payment for sure, but also, as I say, kind of having that regular touch point and being open. You mentioned about forecasting. If you can be open about, obviously the webinar is called second half of the year. If you can give some insight into, none of us have a crystal ball, but as much as you can reasonably forecast, this is what I expect for the second half of the year, then the carriers will be there to support that in the best way that they can. Again, recognizing that there are some constraints on the capacity.
Right. No, that's really good points. Yeah, it isn't all about price for sure, and it is about the relationship and securing that capacity right now. Joy?
Yeah, what are some of I'm just curious because we talked a little bit about inventory balancing, you're talking about forecasting. These are things that are obviously built on some pretty sophisticated data frameworks and some pretty sophisticated systems, right? To be able to model out and forecast out, especially given, the evidence we have, I guess, of the last 3 months of how maybe a geopolitical event or something could considerably impact, right? So maybe you have these really well-built established models, but then you have to go recalibrate, recalculate everything on a moment's notice. So I guess, given that we are a technology company, I'm interested to know a little bit from y'all's perspective, and maybe you specifically, Steve, like what are some of the infrastructure components or even maybe the specific software things that Trax brings to our customers that are going to help facilitate that ability?
Right. Well, I didn't know. I think it's a really good point. And in data framework, which leads to informative decision making in a timely way, in a timely method, is critical, right? So, in other words, finding out something that happened 2 months ago isn't really helpful, right? It's so anecdotal that it's not genuinely helpful. And I've talked about operationalizing the data, right? What I really mean by that is putting a data framework in. So Trax consolidates data, for instance, from multiple sources to bring together information that's meaningful, maybe from a TMS, WMS, an order system, whatever the case, whatever inbound data ASN is needed to formulate a hypothesis about what happened, and in a timely way. And so everyone's working toward this digital modernization stack, right? I need to know now, and I want a holistic picture. And then you throw AI on top of that, which we're doing at Trax, and you have interesting interpretation. And so what AI is doing is taking the work out of building the logic of interpretation, if you will. Now you have to question the answer, and you have to teach AI, and Martin may have a few comments on this too. But my point is if we could take the work out of building the information to create the recommendation out of the data, then there's no burden of looking and asking more questions more frequently. And if you can ask questions more frequently, you're bound to mitigate unexpected increases or unexpected deviations from plan sooner. And the sooner you do that, the cost impact of those deviations are mitigated. So that's when I say mitigation right now is more important than ever for shippers especially, but carriers are doing this too. Make no mistake. Their 3PLs are doing load matching using AI now, so they can benefit from this as well. And again, maybe Martin can make a few comments on that. But I think the framework is critical, the consolidation of data, and then putting AI on top of it to interpret it so there's not a burden of asking the question and asking the question more often. So, Martin, you want to?
Yeah, no, there's a few things there. I think one of the things that's really important, and Steve and I see this, there probably not a week goes by where we don't see this. Shippers are needing, and that intelligence that comes from that data. As a company that's been in this business for over 2 decades, we have that at our fingertips. I think Steve stalled, and we've been using AI. Won't say which company, just in case the other ones get jealous, but we've been using AI just to really gain that kind of additional layer of insight that we maybe didn't already have before, and it's really eye opening. It's the things that you don't expect. It's almost counterintuitive that way. But it's the same in the market. You've saw the diversification of FedEx, spinning off FedEx Freight, Amazon entered the marketplace in the LTL space. So I think it's really interesting as that kind of dynamic and just you're having to continually adapt. So many different situations right now, situation in the Middle East, you have to be adaptable to whatever is going on in the world. And we're seeing more and more of our shippers, probably also some of the carriers as well. I do occasionally get carriers looking for insight. They're not looking for just kind of looking for best practice, looking to understand, well, how can we solve this problem? But certainly shippers are looking for data more now than ever.
Yep.
Martin, you raised a really good word, and that's adapt.
Mm-hmm.
So when the last few webinars, we've been seeing trends that tend to indicate something that is not going to change in the near future, which means you have to shift from a transitory perspective of it to an adapting perspective of it, like tightened capacity and high rates. So I think it's a really nice complement to mitigate and adapt is the theme for today. You like that, Joy?
Well, speaking of adaptation, so allegedly the Strait of Hormuz is reopening. If it does, when it does, obviously that has been a huge disruptive event geopolitically and in the supply chain. So I guess most people in the supply chain and leaders are looking ahead now, considering that the near term could unlock. All of that could then affect fuel costs, which I think is probably the most relevant impact to the most amount of supply chain organizations and leaders. So I guess, knowing that we don't know, right, with absolute certainty what will occur and in what timeline, regardless, how should we be thinking about this? How should supply chain leaders be thinking about this? What are the reasonable decisions to be making or, forecasting to be doing, that kind of thing? Give us your opinion.
Let me just mention a couple of things on fuel, and I hand it over to Martin. So there's the bad news is fuel's up. The good news about fuel, though, is because it's separate in terms of an index and relativeness to other things. It can go down just as soon as it goes up, right? I call it a transitory type aspect of the total cost. And I say that's good and bad because it's hard to really forecast and budget those kind of things, right? But fuel is a little bit different. It's not as hard of a problem to solve, hopefully, as capacity and other things, and nearshoring of manufacturing and all those things that take months and months and months. So let's hope that things get straightened out there. I have no crystal ball again. I would have thought it would have been straightened out by now. It looks like there's some positive signs there, but let's hope that corrects itself in the global market of oil and in a leading indicator of fuel cost it corrects itself. There are mitigating strategies, as I mentioned before, around fuel, and that is fuel is a direct relationship to distance and load and weight and different factors in transportation. So one obvious thing is you want to lower your fuel costs, ship more optimally. Meaning, people get fired when I think Blake said this, our CEO, two webinars ago. You get fired if you say ship less. Nobody's going to ship less. You're going to ship the same that you need to ship to make your revenue targets as a company, but you can ship optimally. And by shipping optimally, for instance, like a modal shift to something that may be slower, will reduce fuel, the fuel aspect of the total cost. For instance, shipping rail, albeit very limited and constricted in terms of lane, is a very low fuel per unit weight method of thing. So that's my 2 cents on it. Martin, you may have a couple comments on fuel as well.
For sure. We talked about it a little bit just in our prep. I've been doing a weekly, calling it a weekly newsletter, internal only for the moment. But it's one of the things I kind of draft on a Wednesday and I publish it every Thursday, unless I'm traveling. But for the most part, it goes out on Thursdays. But I have to check and double check what's the latest update. And obviously, even in the last, I'd say, a week to 10 days, there's been significant development there where I think we all thought there was going to be a positive resolution. It's kind of all went a little bit quiet. I don't know if you guys are distracted by the World Cup. Don't know. But certainly, I've tried to caution in the newsletter, like, this is obviously a very complex situation, and even if it gets resolved, hopefully imminently, it's not as if things magically turn back to everything's okay again. I've tried to temper expectations. And it's as Steve says, there's so many different things going on here that even if fuel, Hormuz reopens, fuel stabilizes or reduces and stabilizes, but there's then all the other things that we've been talking about here. It doesn't fix the capacity issues. So shippers need to be smart. Shippers really need to think, as Steve said, is there a better way, or is there an optimal way for me to move my product, whatever that product may be?
Yeah, totally agree.
Well said. Yes.
Totally agree.
I mean, we could have led with who are we rooting for the World Cup, but I guess we all.
After last night, it's a little bit of a sore topic, but
I wasn't going to ask, and that's why.
We are delighted to be there, and God willing, we will still be there.
Yes.
I'm not going to make any comment, Joy, at all on this. My colleague, I'll let him have the last word on that.
Best of luck to all involved. Excellent.
But what a great event to bring us all together, right?
It is.
In a time where we have a lot of disagreement.
And we're here in Philadelphia, so I'm here, so it's been quite a jubilant and exciting experience.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about nearshoring. We touched on this, the manufacturing sector, chips for AI. There's a lot of buzz in this arena, and I think could be potentially transformative for many in the supply chain. So I want to get a little bit of y'all's commentary on that area, because I think there are rumblings of things that could potentially have massive effects in the next 3-5 years, all of that. So opinions, what you're seeing happen, and what you think it means.
Yeah, Martin, do you want me to start, or you want to?
I think I think you touched on it a few moments ago, but it's one where it is potentially game changing. The concept of kind of moving production closer to home. I know that's been a kind of major, shall we say, strategy in recent months. For me, that's going to be interesting. Everything that happens, there's always a logistics perspective on it. There's always a logistics angle on it. You're then going to have, kind of a lot more regional and cross-border movements. And I think that's interesting for some of the large companies that we work with, for them to change things. They're obviously very capable of it, but it comes with its own challenges. So I would describe that as a structural shift. And it's not a short term. It's not a next 2 months, next 3 months. It's much more of a kind of longer term, probably structural and mindset shift. So.
Yeah, I think the obviously the tariff strategy, as Martin calls it, was purposely implemented to incent factories coming back to the U.S. in the case of our tariffs. But I do agree with Martin. It's a long-term strategy, and it is. Listen, when I used to do optimization strategies for customers, I would look at all the levers, I call them, of where we can save money. And network optimization was always on the list, but because it's structural, as Martin stated, it's not an easy level of effort. You're talking a major level of effort to attain that savings, where there are other levers that have much lower level of effort and shorter duration to execute. So my advice would be, when you're putting these together, these strategies as a shipper, that ought to be on the list, but you just be well aware of the investment and the change structurally to do it, and set it as a long-term strategy where you're executing on the short-term strategies. But I do see some indicators, looking at the ISM and looking at stocks that are related to companies that have equipment, heavy equipment and things like that. I do see an uptick, and if you look at the labor statistics, there's a lot of jobs in the market of construction and building of not only data centers, but a lot of this is also building plants and factories and things. So I think it's taking shape, but we're months and months away. We may not see this in this year, but maybe in next year we'll see it. I think short term, it's going to really help the labor market if you're in a job of electrical, AC, HVAC, any kind of construction. Again, data centers have been blowing it out for months now, and now we may see some of this coming in the way of factories and facilities, and that'll increase the warehousing capacity as well. So long-term play, we'll see. We'll watch the numbers, and but companies, Martin's right, it's a structural change that takes a heavy lift, and usually they also need to have a playbook, meaning when you put a new facility in, you better know exactly how to integrate that into your existing framework. Because if you don't do that right, then you're back to the problem we just mentioned, and that is data silos, inaccurate data measurements, and all the other factors that go into putting in a major change like a network change like that. And that would also, by the way, be a supply change. Even if you shift from supplier A to B, you sort of need to know how to measure the effectiveness of that change. So data, again, and availability of the information and how quickly you assess it and measure it and baseline it is critical to those kind of changes.
Yeah.
That's a long answer, Joy, but
no, I think that's good. And it leads us kind of nicely dovetails into the kind of the final conversation, which, I mean, and I think it's an interesting initial question, is like, in an environment of cost compression, are we going to get the luxury of making decisions that have long-term payoffs rather than short-term payoffs? Who knows? You've talked before, Steve, about how transportation capacity and prices ebb and flow in cycles, not knowing, right, if conditions will persist, how long it will take for those cycles to play out. I guess I kind of want to end with a little bit of a conversation around cost mitigation, because that is probably the thing that every supply chain leader and carrier and everybody, right, is concerned about and interested in. So cost mitigation strategies, and Mark, I thought it was really interesting that you talked about mindset, right, which is a huge component of making any kind of strategic decision in a reasonable way, in an effective way. So yeah, talk to me a little bit about, regardless of what the cycle looks like, the length of this cycle that we're in, what are some of the reasonable cost mitigation strategies that you would say anybody kind of on?
Yeah, and I'll let Martin talk about this too. I think Martin made a really good point, and that is, there's cost, there's service, and if you want, we can throw carbon emissions in there a little bit. Although, when times are tough, that tends to go to the bottom in terms of priority. But I'm not, and that's not a Steve Beda view. I'm just being honest with.
It's that long term that in a cost compression.
Yeah, I'm being honest about how that fits into the overall picture. But companies need to make margin. This is the bottom line, whether that's a carrier or a shipper. And the way you can impact margin outside of improving sales is lower the bottom, improve the bottom line. And so mitigation strategies are really important. Some shippers, like pharma, have limited options there because of service constraints, right? So they can't treat transportation as much like a commodity that maybe somebody else would. Okay. We're also in a very let's just call it consumers demand service as well. So there's a little bit of a get your product on the shelf and get it to the customer as quickly as possible strategy here too. So it's a balance. Same with inventory. But if I had to reiterate a point, and that would be around what I said about the mitigation strategy and levers. There is low-hanging fruit, and Martin knows this because we both looked at data before. There's always low-hanging fruit out there. If you have the data and you have the wherewithal to look at the data and understand it, and that's back to my operationalization of data into the supply chain and the people managing it. So I think that there's always an opportunity there to reduce costs. But I think the real key, and this goes with inventory balance and transportation as well, and that is, I think the shippers learned a lot from the buy forward that we talked about, Joy, from the tariffs. So they're not going to irrationally do this anymore. They're going to probably really think hard about inventory balance with transportation that affects cost. And I think they also need to be very mindful of service and cost, and look for those short-term levers, that I call them, that they could pull that have meaningful impact to their overall transportation costs, which again is the leading cost increase aspect of the LMI aggregate that we just saw. Martin, you want to wrap that up?
Yeah, for sure. I think how long is this going to last? None of us know. I think what's really interesting is we talked about this cycle. This cycle is driven by the supply, not by the demand. A little bit unusual, a little bit different from past couple of years. Supply-led cycles, they tend to last a little bit longer. So, and that's because obviously the capacity is then slow. It's typically quite slow to come back. So, I think my viewpoint is that the real risk right now is what happens when that demand picks up, because there's no slack right now to afford it to pick back up. So, my advice to shippers, don't wait, don't hesitate. As much as you can, try and secure some of that capacity for yourself. But it's about building relationships. It's not about the immediacy of getting the best rate. You need to build that relationship so that ultimately the carrier's there for you when you need it. And the carriers, I mean, at the moment, the carriers are having relatively speaking, are having a good time of it, because they did have a difficult couple of years. One of the things that they'll be doing with this money is perhaps looking to kind of repair or rebalance those balance sheets. Mm-hmm. And for me, they will also have to consider how they can use that to invest, to bridge that capacity constraint. So, as ever, there's never a dull moment, and it's a really exciting time to be in logistics or to be in freight audit.
Great observations. All right. Well, lots of food for thought, lots to walk away from. Any final thoughts? Anything we didn't cover that you guys observed this past month or from the report that we wanted to catch? We said a lot. So.
No, I think that's good, Joy. It's so nice to have Martin give us a perspective of the CARE LSP and how critical that is to logistics in general. So. Awesome. Thanks, Martin, for joining us.
Yeah, we view the carrier as a really important constituent internally at Trax. We can't do their job without them. We can't do our job without them, I should say. So it's really a exciting time, as I said. It's interesting. It's never a dull moment.
Yeah, awesome.
That's for sure.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, guys. So if you have not, make sure that you subscribe to the monthly freight market report. It's free. It's just a subscription. It comes into your inbox, and it is the amalgamation of all the kind of data from each month, each 30-day cycle, and it has Steve's commentary on it. And it's a great resource for just all the intelligence that you will need to make great supply chain decisions. Obviously, if you want to learn more about Trax and you don't already know, go to traxtech.com. We'll have the links in the comments, and tune in every month for a breakdown of the freight market report live. Appreciate you guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Joy.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave.
Talk soon.
Thanks, Martin.